Hello and welcome everybody to today's discussion, how to overcome enterprise storage challenges. I'm Greg Schulz of Server Storage IL. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm an independent IT analyst, author, blogger, consultant, as well as a Microsoft MVP Cloud Data Center Management. Joining me today are Ann Blanchard of Nasuni and John Torr of Cloudian. And what I'd like to do is just take a quick moment and welcome both Ann and John and let them give a brief intro of themselves. Ann?
Sure, Greg. Thank you so much. Very excited to be part of this discussion today. My background is roughly 10 years in on-premises storage, RAID arrays, tape drives, you name it, and 10 years in storage software and cloud storage. And today I'm with Nasuni, which is a leader in cloud-based file infrastructure, and it provides primary file storage, data protection, and file sharing. I'm very excited to be part of the conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Ann. Great to have you as part of our discussion. Hey, let's bring in John Torr.
Hey, Greg. Thanks very much. I'm John Torr. I'm the CMO at Cloudian. I've been with Cloudian for about 4 years, a long career in the enterprise storage business. And Cloudian is S3 compatible storage systems that reside in your data center. So we are on-prem storage that is S3 compatible.
Outstanding. And as I mentioned, our conversation today, and here's just a pictorial of our panelists for our discussion, is going to be looking at overcoming those enterprise storage challenges that are facing everybody today, regardless of the size of your organization. And let's get things started about talking about the current climate, and not just the weather outside, but the environment that we live in today, which, needless to say, there's a lot going on. So one of the first questions I want to throw out there is, I'll go to Ann first and we'll come over to John, is what have we learned from the COVID-19 crisis as it affects data storage within your environment? Ann?
Well, I think what we've learned is that disaster is no longer a regional thing, that access is king. Access to information from anywhere at any time is absolutely critical. And real-time collaboration is important. So is flexibility. You can have a global simultaneous disaster. That's what we've learned from this particular event. And so people's access to information suddenly surfaces as probably the most important thing. And the storage strategy that companies deploy has got to support that.
Great. Hey, John, would you like to comment on that? One of the things that I heard there that really caught my ear from Ann is that the reference to a disaster, normally we think of disaster as the smoking hole, soaking hole, things are gone, but yet now we have the situation where things are still there, data's still there, but you need to be able to get to it from different places. Thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. I think what we've really seen from the COVID crisis is the disaster, as you put it in, playing out in two ways. One is, it's really forcing people to rethink some of their storage infrastructure decisions, and part of the disaster is economic. People are very concerned about cash flow, and at times like this, it kind of forces a conversation about what are we doing to maximize the value of our data, the value of our investment in infrastructure in the future, and it kind of forces new thinking. So we're seeing some people accelerating their journey to the cloud. We're also seeing some people accelerating their journey back from the cloud to on-prem, and it all comes down to cost. What can they do to minimize cost and capital, make sure that they are best positioned for the coming economic insecurity. Also, there's the operation standpoint. You mentioned that people are working remotely. That brings about new security concerns. So how are people addressing that when so many more people are working remotely and users are now exposed to things like ransomware in ways they weren't previously? So those are really the two things we're seeing customers looking to address are the cost equation and then this whole operation challenge of people working remote.
Well, if I could put it back to you, John, is that, in this uncertain time, certainly there's the discussion of, let's cut costs, let's go to the cloud. But yet we're also hearing people saying, you know what, we've been to the cloud, we've got to cut costs, we're going back on-prem. Any perspectives on that?
Well, that's exactly right, because what people find after they've been to the cloud is, that's just another way of managing your infrastructure. It's not a panacea. There are costs associated with that, and depending on your situation, you may have far lower costs operating on-prem. Storing a petabyte of data in the cloud costs you about $20,000 a month. Storing that data on-prem using a solution like ours costs you about $5,000 per month. You definitely have to start thinking about that trade-off in terms of, if I'm looking at my future cash flow, which one is going to position me best for the future, the $20,000 solution or the $5,000? Depending on your situation, there are definitely pros and cons to each. But this situation, the pandemic is definitely forcing that conversation to happen every day.
Great. And what I want to do is bring you back in on this and take a different variation. Sure. What we were talking about just a few moments ago is, you mentioned that, the idea of disaster, and that's, I think, what a lot of organizations focuses on as the disasters, as opposed to business resiliency, application resiliency, keeping things running, part of which is dispersing the workforce, and then your apps, your data are still protected and running. So give us some perspectives about that working from home, that remote impact, the impact on storage and security, but also about how that could become the new norm.
No, it absolutely could. And what it does, what we found with our customers is that, the focus quickly becomes on how do we take knowledge workers, our people, and keep them productive, even though they're calling in or working in from many, many locations. And, Nasuni itself and a lot of its customers literally went from being in an office in downtown Boston to everybody working at home. We've had some of our customers with 8,000 employees or more literally overnight shifting to a work-from-home model. And what that means is that you've got to have systems in place that give your knowledge workers access to critical information and the ability to share that information efficiently and securely, and know how to use those tools beforehand. So, the Nasuni as a solution is a file sharing platform as well as a file storage platform, and the ability to share files securely across multiple geographies for workers to move that information around, work on it sequentially was key to maintaining their productivity. So that is a key piece of this transition and this crisis. The other piece, which, frankly, a lot of folks don't think about is, our brothers and sisters who work in IT itself. And with the crisis, there's really a concern for their safety. Now, they can't always be going into a data center and adjusting, putting in new capacity or adjusting a system. So their ability to manage a system remotely, bring on new users, handle security issues remotely is now kind of a rising requirement as well. So you want to be able to protect your IT workers, and you want to be able to give all your employees productive access to information. That's really what we've seen in terms of the impact on storage with this crisis.
That's a great transition point as well, pun intended, Ann and John. We touched on it a moment ago, is this hybrid approach, whether it's hybrid cloud or hybrid across multiple clouds. It's not just the platforms where the apps and the data are running and hosted, but it's also how it's being managed and being accessed. So let's talk about that a little bit, about it. It's not all cloud or all hybrid. It's what's best for you. What's that balancing act? What are some of the key factors impacting the choice between all cloud, all hybrid, all on-prem? What are some different approaches there? Anna, if you want to go first.
Sure. I mean, the Nasuni solution can be deployed in an all-cloud or a hybrid configuration, and so that's really because we see different environments and different requirements. increasingly, if customers want to run an application in the cloud and want file access off that application, or want to run something like VDI in the cloud, it probably makes sense to have an all-cloud configuration. But if they're very concerned about local performance, then more of a hybrid cloud solution is probably a better fit for them. And if they've got lots and lots of different geographies that are accessing the same information, that might be a better fit. And I just want to be clear, in our case, we're defining hybrid cloud as deploying, some sort of hardware or virtual machine locally and accessing the cloud, or by all cloud. I think what we're defining it as is having every piece of your software functioning in a cloud deployment.
John,
but geography
you in on
is key, application is key.
Sorry to cut you off there,
Yeah.
Ann. My apologies.
No worries.
John, I want to bring you in on this, is that it's, again, a variation of what we touched on just a little bit ago, is that some environments are going to all cloud, some are returning, and let's just elaborate a little bit more on what you're seeing is, one, what should people be thinking about beyond just the cost, but also how do you get your data to the cloud, or how do you get your data back without busting your network budget?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because it all comes down to time and money, right? What's going to save you cost, what's going to give you the lowest total cost, and what's going to give you the access to the data you need in the time that you need it. So we see our customers looking at both environments, on-prem and cloud, and using them in the most effective ways possible. So an example would be for data protection. If you're backing up a bunch of servers on-prem, one option is you could back up all that data directly to the cloud and use that as your backup target. The challenge with that is, you're paying for the bandwidth to get the data there, you're paying for the storage space in the cloud, and then when you need to recover it, how long is it going to take to accomplish that recovery process? What's your RTO, RPO going to be? So an example of where customers are using hybrid cloud to save time and money is by backing up data on-prem to an object storage environment such as Cloudian, and then replicating that data to the cloud so they have a copy which is used for DR, but doing that to in an archival cold storage environment that costs a lot less. Now, that archival cold storage environment is going to be slow to access and is going to be something which is designed for infrequent use, but it will cost you a lot less. So you have a copy on-prem, which is your immediate access, fast RTO, RPO, again, $5,000 a month per petabyte to keep that data on-prem. And then you have a copy in the cloud, which is going to cost you another $5,000 a month, but is designed for infrequent access, but is perfect if you have a disaster and you need that backup copy that is remotely located. So that's an example where rather than paying, paying $20,000 a month to store that data all in the cloud to start with, you can pay half of that, have much better service levels, and still have that long-term DR capability. So that's just an example of where our customers are making that trade-off between cloud and on-prem, and seeing that, hey, they can use both in a hybrid environment and ultimately save themselves time and money.
Well, that's a great transition point there, John, which is, there is the cost, always the conversation about cost. And what I hear so often is people are looking to cut cost as opposed to find and remove cost, and there is a difference. Cutting cost is, chances are, you're going to have an impact somewhere else on availability, performance, service levels, what have you, or increased management. Well, reducing and removing cost is finding the problems, and you started touching on that. And let's just dive into this a little bit more, is if cost is control, and really the cost control. What you just touched on there, I think really makes sense, is that hybrid data protection, rethinking how you're protecting, what you're protecting, when you're protecting it, putting it on the right storage tier, the right storage type, but also where you put it, how you access it. In other words, avoid treating everything the same. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think your question really states it very well. some customers are looking at saying, well, hey, if times are tough economically, I'm better off to just stretch the environment I have. But it comes back to, what are the real impacts of that? So one example would be if you have a storage infrastructure, which is, say, 5 years old and is coming off the lease and you're having to renew support on that, look at the cost of that support contract on that old storage system. You may find that you can buy a new storage system for less than the cost of simply renewing the support on that old system. And that new storage system is going to give you much better capacity, much better availability, and much better cloud compatibility, so you're set up for the future. But this is the kind of trade-off where you could just say, I'm going to keep doing the things the way I have been and ultimately pay more. And you're going to pay more in terms of support costs. You're going to pay more in terms of management costs because that older system is going to take more management bandwidth. And you're going to lose that flexibility you could have by having an environment that works both cloud and on-prem together. It gives you that flexibility to use both interchangeably. So you can't just look at cost in terms of, hey, I can minimize my CapEx by keeping my existing system. You need to look at the whole basket of costs, including the management cost and the support cost, and that value of having that flexibility long term.
Great, thanks, John. Hey, I want to bring you in on this as well. Is give us some perspectives of, again, there's this theme of cutting costs versus finding and removing the complexity and the cost. In other words, if all you do is cut, it's like pushing down on that problem. It's going to pop up somewhere else. What are some things, building off of what John was just talking about, that people can do to find and remove cost and that complexity to really do more with what they have?
Right. It's really key to think of it differently and think of it in terms of investing in flexibility, because disruption is the new normal. We've got to invest in being able to react to constant change. The companies that are going through cost constraints right now are probably going to face mergers, acquisitions, consolidations, unfortunately in some cases bankruptcies. And that puts IT folks at the center of constant change. And what they need is infrastructure around them that allows them to adapt to that change and potentially make gains against that change, as opposed to, progressively underserving, their end users. So you've got to be thinking flexibility at the same time that you're looking at how to reduce costs. And I think, as John mentioned, there are solutions out there today, like a combination of Cloudy and Nasuni, and we do sell our products together occasionally, which is great, that will basically take away costly, repetitive things like backup, disaster recovery, and incorporate them at a much lower cost. And if you're going to go for a private cloud-based file infrastructure, you're going to get rid of a lot of cost from using egress charges, et cetera, from the cloud. There are ways to eliminate existing costs and gain flexibility. And I think that's what folks should be looking at when they're asked to just simply cut costs today. How can I give more access to more users? How can I replace backup, disaster recovery with solutions that have those just built in as a matter of course? That's kind of the new mindset, I think, that needs to be adapted.
And I love that comment, that tagline, that expression, however you want to wrap it, present it. Invest in flexibility. I mean, that ties with, the resiliency, the continuance, all that. And I think part of it is, how do you stretch your budget to go further without just simply cutting? And I think part of that starts with, John was touching on it, is look at your apps, look at your data, avoid treating everything the same. What can you archive out so that you're not having to back it up, replicate it, protect it as frequently? And then where do you place that archive? Local on-prem, on the cloud, in a really low-cost cloud. I mean, that's part of that whole hybrid approach. It's not just hybrid storage, not just hybrid cloud. It's a hybrid management. And, if you think of that, and you were touching on it there, which is, storage hardware is relatively cheap or inexpensive, but managing it, the care, the feeding, the protecting, the configuring it is not, let alone the security. Give us a couple of thoughts on that, and then we'll bring John in on that.
Well, it's an interesting question. I love this. It's why not just buy more? That's actually a strategy I think a lot of like single site data centers have used for many years. Just keep buying more, not really worry about it, and ask the vendor to give it to you at cheaper and cheaper prices. But the problem with that model today is that it's so unpredictable where and you're going to need storage, how much you're going to need it, who's going to need it, geographically, where is that storage going to be needed. And so that unpredictability around both where and how much and when is a new factor. And not even just adding a lot of additional capacity in your data center is going to meet that kind of new, is going to solve that unpredictability. So that's where the cloud comes in, and solutions that are cloud-based have so many advantages because they can be deployed very flexibly to multiple sites. And with a file infrastructure solution like Nasuni, you can just deploy capacity, literally from a console to any site around the company and give them as much capacity as they need and provide backup and disaster recovery. So you need that kind of multi-site deployability, but you need that ability to respond to changes at the same time. So management is a different game than just adding more capacity, I think, is part of the answer to that.
Great, thanks. John, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to look at this from two angles, Greg. First of all, I think the question on the slide here is, why not just buy more and not worry about it? Just buy more of the existing storage and get on with life. I think that thinking is very limiting because you've got to understand how storage and your data interrelate. Let me give you an example. Ransomware. This is something we're all very concerned about today. Ransomware attacks are on the rise. They've actually increased since the start of this COVID situation. Protecting yourself from ransomware is a very complicated proposition, and in fact, most of the barrier defenses, perimeter defenses, ultimately have flaws, and people can break through them, and that's where ransomware attacks happen. But you have a way on storage of providing yourself a bulletproof solution for ransomware, and that is a write once, read many infrastructure where you can store data and make it immutable. If your data is stored in a way that's immutable, it's protected from ransomware. Well, you can accomplish that the old-fashioned way by storing your data to tape and moving that data off-site. Most people don't do that. It's so much hassle involved, and you have to actually be physically present where that storage is all the time to make that happen. And of course, today that's more challenging than ever. Modern storage, such as Cloudians, gives you a worm option, which is built in and actually integrated with backup workflows. So you can get protection from ransomware that's just part of an automated workflow. So here's an example where, moving on to a more modern version of storage rather than just, buying whatever you have and not worrying about it. Moving on to something which is more modern can build in protections against threats that are relatively recent in their occurrence, that are pervasive and can ultimately cost you a lot of money. So yes, you could look at it as something as, hey, this is storage is cheap and it's, just buy more. That's ultimately going to cost you because you're losing that protection against something which could cost you far more in the future, which is loss of data, loss of reputation, loss of time. It's just one example of where, an infrastructure that is more modern can do so much for you. The second thing is, you're losing that flexibility, as Ann was saying, of having that cloud versus on-prem option of moving data wherever. We can store data in a data format which is identical to the cloud. That will give you the option of using a Nasuni solution on-prem or a Nasuni in the cloud, or any other S3 compatible solution can now be used in either place. So as the IT manager, you've now got long-term options about how you're going to manage your infrastructure. And options always save you money because when you have two things to pick from, you can always pick the least expensive of the two. If you don't have those options, you're stuck with whatever is sitting in front of you. So think about data management in terms of how am I protecting my data from ransomware? How am I setting myself up for the future? Both of those things can be addressed with a more modern storage infrastructure.
John, that's a great setup and a transition, and a couple things, certainly the air gap concept in there, investing. I mean, organizations need to start thinking in terms of investing in their data infrastructures, the storage, the hardware, the software, the management. Treat them as assets as opposed to an overhead. By investing, they can actually save by not having to pay a ransomware or be impacted by it. And I think there's another theme in there, which is having that modern data center, having that modern data infrastructure, having that modern technology, but start using that technology in new ways instead of simply using the new stuff in old ways, which is a nice way to transition into this whole topic of security and data protection. Let's bring Ann back in on that, because, Ann, you brought up earlier about investing in that flexibility. So let's talk about investing in security, investing in data protection. We'll come back to John.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we talk about modern solutions to storage problems, as John mentioned, the write once, read many capability of writing to the cloud in a way that's immutable is absolutely critical, and it's a key aspect of how we protect customers from ransomware. We give them the ability to keep infinite versions and roll back to wherever they were before the attack. But that sort of notion that you need multiple products is another, to provide security, is another thing that you should re-examine. I think when you're looking at a modern solution, there are many solutions today that build in ransomware protection, backup, disaster recovery. They're more inclusive because of the scalability, in part, that the cloud gives. You have this ability to store your data and recover from problems more quickly with one solution as opposed to many, many different solutions. And when you're in a situation recovering from ransomware, the problem with more traditional solutions is it takes a long, long time to back up lots and lots of data that may have been hit by the ransomware attack. It can take days, sometimes a week or more, for a full file restore with traditional tape backup. That's just not acceptable in terms of getting your business back up and running. So some of these more modern solutions have a way or enable much faster recovery, much faster restore of files than we've seen with traditional technologies. And that's an aspect of security, that notion of getting back up and running quicker. Another thing that's really key is, since Nasuni is a file sharing solution on top of a file storage solution, we do a lot of synchronization and collaboration with files in the cloud, is encryption. You want to make sure that whatever solutions you are using to move your files around, move your storage around, is intelligently using encryption, and that's not yet another thing that you have to buy or pay an extra dollar amount for.
That's great perspective there, Ann, and I like that idea is you're bringing in this notion of protection in different ways, the security, the encryption, having copies, building off of what John was talking with the air gaps, but also that notion of productivity. And John, why don't you come back in and help, let's expand on this a little bit, is that productivity is a part of it, is that your protection scheme should not be a barrier to productivity. It should be an enablement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what I was saying is you have to have a protection from ransomware, which is part of a standard workflow. So it doesn't take any extra steps in order to implement it. And having that immutable data, that's when you should ask your supplier is, how are you protecting my backup copies? Because just having a backup copy itself is not protection, because guess what? The hackers know you have it, and that's the first thing they go and encrypt. So having a backup copy is not protection. You have to have a backup copy which has been made unchangeable. And we've invested a tremendous amount at Cloudian, hundreds of thousands of dollars in certification testing and engineering improvements to harden our solution and make it suitable for we're actually certified by the SEC as non-rewritable media. So that says even if you have physical access to the box, you cannot alter the media. So even if a hacker managed to get into your data center, they wouldn't be able to change or delete that data. And that's what I mean when I'm saying, really protecting yourself from the threats in a way which is part of a workflow and is therefore, very efficient. If it's not easy to use, if it's not efficient, it's not going to be used repeatably, and that's not going to give you the protection you want. So the certification is really critical for this because that's what gives you that protection and keeps you productive.
So, John, as a part of that certification, let's state the obvious. That also includes the ability to report, that you can generate that report, that certificate, to show that, not only are you compliant with your technology, but that something was securely erased or securely preserved when you have to undergo an audit.
Absolutely. So we have extensive log collection. We just introduced a product called HyperIQ, which is our log collection and management software for our environment, and it provides you not only collection of logs, but a visual presentation of who's accessing what data. And most importantly, you can see who's accessing data they shouldn't be accessing. So you have a visual look at exactly what's going on in your environment. So not only do you have the logs for that long-term audit that you're talking about right now, Greg, but also you have a visual view of what's going on right here and now. So you can make sure that your storage environment is being used in the way that you intended it, not the way the hackers intended it. And that's something, again, that's very important as part of a modern storage infrastructure is you have that kind of visibility. The nice thing about cloud is it's raised everyone's expectations for what you should be able to do. You want simplicity, you want scalability, you want lights out management. Well, the whole point of Cloudian is to bring you that same kind of infrastructure and put it in your own data center. So you have those same set of tools, that same visibility, that same simplicity, but it's residing in your data center, again with the objective of keeping your productivity at a maximum.
That's great. Hey, I want to work in an audience question here, and we touched on this, but it's a good opportunity to dwell on it a little bit, is security is now an issue since the pandemic and working from home, logging from different places. How can we secure our data and applications?
Well, I can start with that. I mean, we have a collaboration tool that provides you a secure file sync and share. So we have a tool that will let you access data from anywhere, provide other people access to it in a secure way, and actually monitor that information to make sure that no PII or otherwise secured information is being moved around in a way that you did not intend. So think of it as kind of like a Dropbox on steroids. It's a secure Dropbox inside your data center where you have control over the infrastructure, but also providing you a lot more security in terms of how people are using that data.
Great. I just want to jump in here real quick, and then I'm going to come to you, Ann.
Sure.
To our attendees, go ahead, submit those questions, and we'll work them in. We've got a few more minutes here to work some of your questions in. Ann, can you expand on that a little bit as well?
Sure. I think just being able to integrate whatever file access solution you've got, in case of Nasuni, into your LDAP, your ACL systems. Of course, you want to have encrypted file movement. You want to basically have your file access and file sharing solution part of your whole IT security infrastructure, have it fit in seamlessly. That's why some more sort of solutions that exist outside of IT, are problematic because you want it to be fully integrated with your current security, and access control systems.
So part of that, again, I want to state the obvious because sometimes the obvious isn't stated or isn't obvious, is there's protecting your applications, i.e. the actual applications, and along with their configurations. There's protecting the data, where there's a lot of focus, but also protecting your own environment, the overall configurations, the settings, all of which needs to be protected as part of a holistic security and data protection approach. Ann?
No, absolutely. That you don't want people with access to your system settings, to how you've got your entire, information set up, put together. You've got to make sure you've got that perimeter protection. You also want to be able to monitor kind of the health of that perimeter. If you've got a lot of different points of access to the data, you want to know who's doing it, as John mentioned. So you want some audit capabilities, and you want to know how your edge environment is working. You want some health monitoring in place so you know where access is happening, how performance is working for each of those end users. You basically want to stay on top of how well the system is working at the edge, as well as, your basic file system.
And John, you were talking about this earlier, about the logging, the certification, stuff like that. I mean, without that insight, without that information, you're flying blind, and particularly in the clouds, which isn't always a good thing. Tell us a little bit more about leveraging that insight and without becoming overwhelmed by all that log information.
Absolutely. So that's where Hyper IQ provides that visual view, so you can set alerts that are relevant to exactly what you're concerned about. If you've got some data that's secure, you want to know who's accessing it. If someone tries to access it that's not in that group, you can receive an alert. So we can make it simple for you to focus on the things that are most important to you, and deprioritize the things that are less important. And this is part of having an on-prem infrastructure is you're using your entire security infrastructure to your advantage. So you take that data off-site, you're now working with a security infrastructure which is completely different. If you built up a security infrastructure in your own data center, keeping that data there lets you use all of the access controls, all of the tools that you've already designed and implemented can still be fully leveraged for that data on-prem. And really all then you're managing is anything anomalous going on in this environment, as opposed to having to go somewhere completely different, and now you're having to learn a whole new set of controls. So we think there's some real advantages from a security standpoint of keeping your data where you have all that infrastructure in place. You know all the tools that have been designed and delivered, and you can do things that are such as ransomware protection that will give you that extra level of security to know that your data has been made immutable and unchangeable. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're some of that flexibility of the cloud combined with your on-prem infrastructure you've already deployed.
Outstanding. So we've got a couple of minutes here, and let's start to wrap up. Take a couple of minutes each, Ann and John. Give us some closing comments, some tips, some recommendations, some things that our attendees can do next. In other words, that call to action. Give us some tips, recommendations, where they should do, what they should do next, that they can take away and start addressing all these challenges that we've been talking about pertaining to overcoming enterprise storage challenges. Ann, I'll go with you first.
Sure. I mean, I'd say two things. First, look at your cost structure and look at where you're spending money on backup, disaster recovery, on trying to manage the capacity requirements for your unstructured data at multiple sites. Look up regionally or even across the whole company if you have that ability. Our customers are really surprised when they start to add up how much storage they're using, in our case for file storage, across 5, 10, 20 sites. It very quickly gets to the petabyte levels that John was mentioning. And then start to look at your backup costs for all of that storage. How much are you spending on your backup licenses, your hardware, your tapes, maybe even shipping tapes off-site?
So
then
having that awareness is key.
That's right. We find a number of IT folks maybe look at one slice of this, but you have the time sometimes because of this crisis to step back and look at the whole picture. And that's what I really recommend. Look at how much you're spending on your entire infrastructure And in our case, look at how much you're spending on your file infrastructure, which includes capacity across multiple sites, your backup, the disaster recovery that you might have set up, or the replication that you might have set up for one or two of those sites, because they're extremely important to your operations. Look at that whole cost, and then start to look at options for how to reduce that cost with a solution that maybe includes all of that in it or parts of that in it, and leverages the economics of the cloud and leverages some of the simplicity of the cloud, and do a comparison. And
Great.
you know, if you're working with Nasuni, we'd help you do that comparison. But do a comparison of your current traditional way of doing things, including all of that, versus what some of the newer options are for you.
Great. And before I come back to John with his comments, quick, Ann, from your perspective, any new concerns, challenges with growth in HIPAA regulations and PII information and HR legal? You know, we've touched on it broadly, but anything that people should be aware of? Any resources that you at Nasuni have that you can help with the taking action?
Well, certainly make sure that any solution meets your basic, you know, security requirements, but that should not be an obstacle. There are a number of solutions out there that are secure, and the cloud itself is secure, whether you're going with a private cloud solution like Cloudian, or even the public cloud vendors have, you know, many, many, many different certifications. So I wouldn't have that as an obstacle to looking at cloud solutions anymore. I think that time has passed. I think many of the cloud solutions, if not all of them, are highly secure. And think about the security benefits you get from simpler management, from, as John was saying, having kind of a whole workflow where ransomware and backup and whatever are all integrated. Those simpler workflows ultimately mean better security for your data.
Outstanding. Thanks, Dan. Let's start over to John to help wrap this all up. John?
Yeah, I would say the call to action is, you know, start with a simple use case like a target for your backup environment. I mean, you can back up on-prem for a third the cost of backing up to the public cloud. And by starting with that private cloud environment in your data center for that single use case, you've now positioned yourself to protect your data from ransomware, which is a great thing. You've also positioned yourself to use hybrid cloud, so you've got a common data format between on-prem and what you can use in the cloud. And that will set you up for a whole set of new use cases down the road for file, for other kinds of data that are accumulating in your environment, but you need to store them, you need to manage them. How are you going to do it at less cost? Start with something simple like a backup target, and then expand on that. You'll save cost, you'll protect your data, and ultimately you're going to be better positioned for the future.
Outstanding. And just to wrap up here, we're about out of time. I just would like to thank everybody for attending today, especially thank you to Ann Blanchard of Nasuni, John Tor of Cloudian. It's been a fantastic conversation. It feels like we're just getting warmed up, and we could go on and on and on and dig deeper into all these. But again, thank you, Ann. Thank you, John. Thank you, all of our attendees. And on behalf of myself, Greg Schulz of Server Storage IL, I'd like to thank all the participants for listening in on our discussion today, how to overcome enterprise storage challenges, with Ann Blanchard of Nasuni, John Tor of Cloudian. And with all of that, have a nice day. Okay, enough said.